welcome back to Philosophy for the Lockdown and Beyond. Okay, my name is Nassika, I'm a moral philosopher and I am not a relativist. If you followed the other videos, hopefully all that will make sense for you. If you don't understand any of it at all, it's probably best to go and watch the other videos before you watch this one, otherwise you risk getting a little bit lost. But for those of you who have watched the other videos, you now know that I like asking why questions, that I'm interested in questions that have to do with what you should or ought to do, and I think there is a truth of the matter when it comes to morality. That is, morality is not like whether I like Brussels sprouts or not. There is a truth of the matter to be discovered about it, even though it is very, very difficult to find out what that truth might be, and there is a lot of disagreement about it. Okay, today we're going to start talking about one of the three normative theories that we're going to look at. Normative theories are theories that look at moral questions regarding what we should and ought to do. So they try to discover what is the truth of the matter about morality. How should we behave when we come across moral situations? So these theories give answers to those kinds of questions, the content of the should and the ought, and a little story sometimes about where the force of morality, the normativity, this moral push comes from to get us to do the right sort of thing. And these theories disagree with each other, and this happens a lot in philosophy. As soon as somebody proposes one idea, there's somebody else who says that this idea is wrong. So you're going to get three different answers to the question of what should I do, how should I behave morally, consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. There are other possibilities, but there isn't time to deal with all of them as it is. We're running through at a really fast pace over all these kinds of ideas. So for example, today we'll talk about consequentialism and some objections to the theory. This would normally take me 5 or 6 lectures and seminars in a university degree to introduce the students to these ideas. Okay, and we're going to do it in less than 45 minutes. So that means you're going to get a very brief and abbreviated version of these things. Consequentialist theories. Consequentialist theories do what it says on the tin. They ask you to look at consequences. You ask, what is the right thing for me to do? What should I do here? You should do whatever brings about the best consequences. And this is kind of appealing because if morality is about anything, it's about making a difference. Remember, you're an agent, you're not a stone. You're someone whose ideas and beliefs and desires and values get expressed in the world through your actions. So if morality is about anything, then it must be about the changes you bring about in the world, the consequences that your actions have. Therefore, you should try and bring about the best kind of consequences. That all sounds really convincing, doesn't it? But other normative theories are going to disagree just with this very basic idea that we should look at consequences. So I'll just tell you a little bit very quickly about what else you might be looking at. What are the alternatives that we're going to consider when we discuss deontology and virtue ethics. So here you are the agent and you're faced with a moral question. What should I do here? And we know that consequentialists are forward-thinking. They're thinking about what will happen now that you act rather than what happened in the past. There are theories that are interested in what happened in the past. What happened to you here that brought you to this position so that you are this kind of person who makes these kinds of decisions? How did you develop to come to this point? Virtue ethics are really interested in these kinds of questions. There are also theories that are interested in what happens internally here in terms of your agency that is expressed out there. So not so much the consequences, but intentions and motives. What you were intending to do rather than what happened in the world. Sorry, the dogs are just intending to play with each other right in front of the video camera. Guys, go away. Go somewhere else now. Okay, so consequentialists are interested in the consequences or the results of the action. So they have some story to explain what are the best consequences. Because what you're supposed to do when you're faced with a situation is to bring about the best consequences. So the theory owes us an explanation of what are best consequences. Okay, time for a little thought experiment. You have 50 euros to spend and you have only 2 choices. I know this example is unrealistic, but as I've told you before, I'm trying to get you to see a point. So I'm going to take away all sorts of distractions from this example so that we stick with the point that we're trying to see. So you've got 50 euros to spend and only 2 choices. You can spend it on a new dress for yourself, and it's a fabulous dress. It's the kind of dress that makes you feel very confident and very happy, and you're going to have a really good time wearing this dress. Or you can give it to a charity that very effectively, you don't have any doubts about the effectiveness of this charity, very effectively is going to bring clean water to people who live without clean water and therefore suffer from a variety of diseases and problems that are caused from drinking contaminated water, and are maybe even at risk of dying because they don't have access to clean water. Okay, so you have a choice. Where should you give, see, it's a moral choice, where should you give your 50 euros? To the company that makes the dress or to the people who need it for clean water? I want you to take a few minutes, think about that. If you can, ask as many people as you can find what they would choose, and I want you to ask them to give you a one-sentence reason for this choice. I would choose to X or Y because this, that or the other. Okay, off you go. Go ask as many people as possible. Okay, as always, I don't know what kind of answers you got, but it is possible that people who wanted to spend their money on the dress would have said things like, well, I'm going to get a lot of enjoyment from the dress. It's going to make me feel really good. I'm going to have a lot of fun wearing it. And to be honest, I've had a miserable time with the lockdown, so I need to cheer myself up. Not to mention also that the dress buying contributes to the economy. There is a fashion house that designed the dress. There is a magazine that is selling the dress. So therefore, I'm even contributing to the economy that's suffering because of the lockdown by putting my 50 euros back into it. People who perhaps decided on the charity would have said, well, this is a very important cause. People who don't have clean water suffer from a variety of horrific diseases. They also have to spend most of their day walking to get the water and therefore are not in education or are not able to take up jobs that might bring them more money. So it's a horrible downwards cycle that affects their lives in a number of very horrific ways. And some of these people may even die because of the lack of access to clean water. So my 50 euros could really contribute to improving the lives of quite a few people in the village where, for example, my 50 euros goes towards digging a well of clean water. Okay, those two are valid types of reasons for the choice that you might make, but what would a consequentialist say? Consequentialist advises you that the right thing to do is whatever brings about the best consequences. So here you would have to list the variety of different consequences of either buying the dress or not buying the dress, of giving the money to charity and not giving the money to charity, and then adding it all up to see which comes out on top. The option that brings about the best consequences is the one that you should do. Now, the important bit here is that you matter. It's not as if you don't matter. The consequentialist is not going to say that we discard, for example, your enjoyment from wearing the dress, or the fact that wearing the dress might make you feel more confident. You matter in this calculation as well, but so does everybody else. And you all matter equally. Let's imagine, even though it's a little bit implausible, that we could attribute numerical values to these kinds of pleasures and the kinds of suffering that are involved in the two options. So you get maybe 1 unit of pleasure from wearing the dress out with your friends when the lockdown finishes, and 1 unit of pleasure from the confidence that you get from wearing the dress. And let's say you get 5 units of pleasure as well because your 50 euros contributes to the economy. So it goes towards the income of the shop owner, the income of the people working in the fashion house, the income of the people making the actual dress, and so on. So you end up with, let's say, 7 units of pleasure in total from spending the money on your dress. On the other hand, the money could have gone to the charity that offers the clean water. Now here we have, let's say, 10 units of pleasure because people don't have to walk a really long distance to get clean water anymore. 10 units of pleasure because now they can go to schools and they can get other jobs that brings them money. 10 units of pleasure because now they don't suffer from diseases that come from dirty water, and 20 units of pleasure from not seeing their relatives die because of lack of access to clean water. I think that makes 50 units of pleasure overall, doesn't it? But it doesn't matter. The point is that what's happening with the money that goes for clean water produces so much greater pleasure than the dress could ever produce for you that it is quite clear that you should give the money to the charity that produces clean water. It is a calculation of pleasures and suffering, and even though yours counts, it just gets outweighed by how much good the 50 euros could produce somewhere else. Okay, so this is a consequentialist theory. And all consequentialist theories need to give us an account of what are the best consequences. See, here I was talking already about pleasure and pain and suffering, because this is one of the most widely discussed consequentialist theories. It's called utilitarianism because it talks about bringing about utility, and utility here is pleasure, happiness, or the lack of suffering, the lack of pain. Utilitarianism is a theory that was originally developed by Jeremy Bentham and was then further advanced by John Stuart Mill, and it has a very compelling and easy to grasp general principle. Whatever kind of moral situation you come across, whatever sort of choice you have to make, whatever moral question the world throws out at you, you should follow the greatest happiness for the greatest number principle. That means maximize happiness as much as possible. Yeah? Giving the money to the charity is better than keeping it for yourself because it brings about more pleasure overall for the greatest number, for as many people as possible. And all the people here count equally. It's a very egalitarian theory, and that is one of its great advantages. You cannot say, I love myself more than anybody else, therefore the pleasure of me wearing the dress is multiplied by 1,000,000, and therefore any choice I have to make is always best to be self-serving because I matter more than anybody else. Everybody matters the same. And this approach of consequentialist theories is a great advantage when you have to make certain types of decisions. Imagine you are the head of a government organisation that tries to distribute public healthcare resources. So your money, your revenue comes from taxes. Everybody has contributed to it, and you need to give it out to the people who need public healthcare. How are you going to distribute these resources? Now, a very simplistic way is to give the same to everyone. So let's say everybody gets 10 units of healthcare access per year, and they get to use it whichever way they want. That seems a little bit counterintuitive. There are many years in which I never see my doctor at all because I just don't have any healthcare needs. What am I going to do with these 10 units of healthcare access? It's a bit pointless. The other side, when I hurt my back really badly, I had a major emergency operation, I needed a specialist doctor, I needed a physiotherapist. That was more than my 10 units. So simply giving everybody 10 units doesn't make sense. The consequentialist would advise you to use those units that you have at your disposal to distribute to people so as to bring about the best consequences possible. And one way of cashing that out is to bring about the greatest pleasure, to fulfill the most needs. Okay. For example, when somebody needs an operation, that's where you put your resources more. When somebody doesn't have any healthcare needs, you don't give anything to them. And this is fair because it's the best use of the resources available. These kinds of principles are really effective in some situations and are, for example, extremely popular when you have to make triaging decisions. The next 2 or 3 minutes might be a bit upsetting for anybody who has had to deal with personal decisions regarding access to healthcare during the pandemic situation. You might want to skip the next 5 minutes if you don't want to hear about resource distribution because somebody close to you has perhaps, or you yourself, has perhaps suffered from COVID-19 and you have found it difficult to access healthcare resources and help. So consequentialist reasoning is behind kind of triaging situations that we normally see in healthcare in war or in pandemics. In a pandemic or in a war, you have a huge demand for healthcare. Suddenly the demand outstrips supply, greatly so, and you have to decide who to distribute these scarce resources to. So you have 1 ventilator and 3 patients. Who always going to get that one ventilator. And how do you make this decision morally as you ought to do it? Consequentialist says, bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's the utilitarian consequentialist. There's only one type of consequentialism. And that means you should use your resources in the most effective way. So if patient number 1 would survive even though they did not use the ventilator, and patient number 2 would only survive if they had the ventilator, and patient number 3 wouldn't survive even though you gave them the ventilator, then the only one who should get the ventilator is number 2. Number 1 may still suffer, and that is bad, but giving them the ventilator wouldn't change the outcome. They would survive anyway. Number 3 will definitely suffer, and that is bad, but giving them the ventilator would be pointless because they would take up a resource without producing a good consequence in the end. The most effective use of the ventilator is for number 2, where the ventilator brings about good consequences. It changes the outcome from a patient who would have died without it to a patient who would not have died without it. Now here, utilitarianism and generally consequentialist theories are very effective because they give us a formal way of looking at things. We can assign numbers to different outcomes based on whether they would produce suffering or pleasure. We can treat everybody equally, everybody's suffering or pleasure counts the same, and then we put all this into a big calculation and we come into an answer that clearly tells us what we should be doing in each situation. Okay, so this impartiality, this equal treatment of everybody, this idea that my pleasures and my interests don't count more than anybody else's is one of the great advantages of consequentialism. Here is a little objection. This objection was first put to Jeremy Bentham. The example was pushpin, which probably nobody would understand now, so let's use a different example. So we're trying to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and imagine we could direct the citizens in our society, we could direct their pursuits. So we realise that every time somebody eats a donut, they get 1 unit of happiness, and every time they spend their entire day playing Fortnite, they get 1 unit of happiness. So that seems like a good way of increasing pleasure. We direct all our citizens to eat donuts and play Fortnite. Given enough donuts and enough Fortnite hours, we can really maximise good consequences. If we have a lot of people, this is just a numbers game. They're just eating donuts, constantly playing Fortnite, constantly. You could end up with millions and millions of units of pleasure. And that suddenly seems like the best moral life. The good life is to engage in these tiny little units of pleasure so that donut by donut, we suddenly have this enormous amount of pleasure, and this is what we ought to do. Now, Bentham was criticised for this conclusion because how could it be that the moral life, the good life, the life that we ought to lead as human beings, is just to eat donuts and play Fortnite? This is the life of a pig who wallows in mud and enjoys the sunshine and eats its food and doesn't look beyond anything but those tiny instant bits of gratification. Along comes John Stuart Mill, who responds to this objection, and this is often how philosophy develops. There is a suggestion, there is an objection, there is a reply, then people come back to that, and the original suggestion changes in light and all of this and becomes more sophisticated. So John Stuart Mill's answer is, not all pleasures are the same. This is a sophisticated theory. This is a theory that says that some pleasures, if we're going to award them a mathematical value, are going to be more important than others. So if you get 1 unit of pleasure for the donut, you're going to get 1,000 units of pleasure from watching a work of art. So the pleasure you get from the sophistication of appreciating aesthetic beauty is much more valuable than the pleasure you get from the donut. He assigns different values to higher pleasures than lower pleasures. That makes the calculation more sophisticated. It isn't just about donuts and Fortnite, even though these things are good, they produce good consequences, they produce pleasure. It's also about watching paintings, having friendships, engaging in philosophy. That's one of the things that can give you a higher type of pleasure. That means that the calculations that you need to do as a consequentialist can become extremely sophisticated. I once met a gentleman who sat on the governing body for deciding what kind of healthcare resources should be available to NHS patients in the UK. The NHS is the public healthcare system. This body is called NICE, National Institute for Clinical Excellence. He basically decides all the options for treatment and says which ones should be available to the public through the publicly funded healthcare system. And they, as you would expect, use consequentialist type reasoning. If there is a drug available that is experimental, so that we don't really know what its results are going to be, and we don't really know what side effects it might have, but we're hoping that it's going to help cancer patients, they have to decide, is it worth spending the money on this drug? And of course, the problem with all these decisions is that nobody has an unlimited pot of money. Usually, the money is much, much smaller than the needs that people have. So how do you decide between an experimental drug that might prolong the life of someone with stage 4 breast cancer, so it might prolong their life by 6 to 12 months, against 14,000 hip replacement operations that tend to be needed by people who are older, but have imposed great restrictions on the lives of these people, both in terms of pain and reduced mobility, and also psychological effects of all these types of suffering, against offering IVF treatment to 20 infertile couples. How do you decide between these three options? Well, you try to give numbers to everything. You try to quantify how much does it count to be in pain because you can't walk because of your hips. How much does it count to not be able to go to your dance classes because you can't walk from your hips? How much does it count, the psychological pain of not being able to conceive a child naturally when you want to do so? How much is the value of 3 months extra life when you are a patient with terminal cancer? And then they try to put this against each other in a massive, massive calculation. And of course, this has huge empirical implications. They look at empirical studies of what it is like to live with cancer, what it is like to suffer from pain, and they come up with really, really interesting conclusions. I'll just give you one, because when I heard it, I thought this bit was so interesting. I like to tell everybody I know about it. Studies of what people think might be a bad situation to be in, the kind of situation that causes suffering, produce different results from studies of people who are actually in this situation. So what you think is going to be bad suffering when you don't have it, when you imagine what it would be like to have it, are completely different, have completely different results from studies of people who are actually suffering from this condition or are in this situation. So for example, typically, people imagine that they would suffer a lot if they had to use a wheelchair, but they wouldn't suffer very much if they had tinnitus, the ongoing hearing problems where you might hear a constant noise in the background day and night. In reality, people who do use wheelchairs report quite a high quality of life as long as they have access to whatever it is that they want to do. Their suffering and dissatisfaction with their lives comes at moments where they're blocked from accessing what they want to do. On the other hand, people with tinnitus describe the situation as possibly suicidal inducing. The suffering of having a constant noise in the background day and night is supposed to be indescribable. Okay, so all that means is that calculating consequences can be a very, very complex matter. We can flippantly attribute 1 unit of pleasure to the donut eating as opposed to 1,000 units of pleasure to watching a piece of art, but all of this is very subjective. You may have found my comparison of 1 to 1,000 quite perplexing, or even quite annoying as well. You might have turned around at that point of the video and said, "What are you talking about, Nassika? I'd get 1,000 units of pleasure from Fortnite and 0 from watching enjoying a piece of art. I simply wouldn't enjoy it at all. So these things are very subjective, and it can be very difficult to quantify, even though it can be very helpful as well when we manage to do so. Quite a lot of assumptions go into it. Another way in which consequentialist theories have become more sophisticated is whether they're talking about actual or expected consequences. So sometimes we try to do things, but they don't work out quite as we wanted them to. Let me give you an example. Sometimes I have students in my class when we have seminars, just small group discussions of about 15 students, who are very quiet. And they're quiet the first week, the second week, by the third week I start worrying about them because I have no idea what's happening. Are they lost? Are they bored? Are they not following? I don't really know what is happening or how I could help them. So I have a variety of teaching strategies I've developed over the year that can help these students at least talk, and then I can figure out where they are and what is happening. I break my larger group into smaller groups. I encourage people to take turns to report back on the findings of these smaller groups. I gently ask these specific individuals directed questions. What do they think about X, Y, or Z? And see what happens. On the whole, the strategy works quite well. Most people who were perhaps reluctant to contribute before find that they can make a contribution. It's a good one, they're encouraged, that gives them more confidence, and they can contribute more to the group. Some people who are lost and not too sure what's happening, I pick up on that and then I can go back and help them pick up the line of thought again. Because if the whole group has moved on and you're left behind and you have no idea what you're talking about, you're not going to catch up unless I stop and take you with us, show you again where it is that we're all going together. So on the whole, these strategies work well. But every so often, of course, they will backfire. There will be somebody who finds the attention overwhelming. Perhaps they were doing perfectly fine. They just didn't want to talk, but they understand everything, they have their own ideas, they just didn't want to share them with the rest of the group. And they would have been perfectly fine had I not effectively picked on them. I was not intending to pick on them, but maybe the consequences of all my little teaching strategies are to put them off rather than to encourage them. What can the consequentialists say about that? Am I responsible for bringing about these bad consequences as well? Well, consequentialists have tried to develop their theories in ways that talk not so much about the actual consequences of what happened, but more sophisticated things like the expected consequences. So it's not the consequences that happened out in the world, but so much more the expected consequences of someone who had thought about the situation beforehand and had taken reasonable precautions to come up with the right sort of consequences. So if you reflect in advance about your options, if you try to bring about the most reasonable consequences possible and they don't actually come out in the real world, this may not necessarily be your fault. Perhaps all you need to do is follow the correct kind of procedure that in general produces the good consequences. That's it. For example, you might have a rule that says don't break promises, because in general when you break promises, bad consequences come about. This doesn't mean that there won't be a case where by breaking the promises, you wouldn't get good consequences. It is possible, but you're not omniscient. Consequentialism doesn't expect you to know all the possible consequences of your actions, only the ones that are reasonable to predict. So it might ask you to follow rules that generally produce the right consequences, or it might ask you to develop the right sorts of dispositions. Somebody who is truthful would tend to produce good consequences, because telling the truth generally does tend to produce good consequences. Okay, so that is the fastest run through consequentialism possible. Let's look at some objections now. Now, we're going to stop after the objections because that's as much time as we've got, but I don't want you to be left with the idea that the objections are the end of the matter and that consequentialism is a theory that falls at all these hurdles, because actually the theory has a centuries-long history of debate and development, and it has multiple and extremely complicated and diverse answers to all these objections. So the theory itself has changed in response to these objections. So don't think that this is the end of the matter for consequentialism, even though it will be the end of the matter for this lecture. Okay, first objection. Imagine that you make some money, you've got your first job, right? And you've covered the basic essentials. You have somewhere to live, and you have sufficient heating, food, add internet if you must to that. And you've covered your basic utility needs, and you've paid your taxes, and you're left over, let's say, with a sum of money. And you could spend it any which way you want. You could buy that dress we were talking about, you could take a holiday, you could buy a car. These are things that people generally do. But at what cost? Given the world we live in, and given the massive inequalities in wealth between people in some countries and people in other countries, and I'm not talking about billionaires here, people who live in the Western world, who are perfectly ordinary people, live at a level of well-being and access to goods and services that is astounding to people who live in some of the other countries in the world. Yes? If you haven't got access to clean water and you haven't got enough food to feed yourself and your children, the idea of going on holiday or buying a car or even buying a dress is quite extraordinary. Okay? So given the state of the world, and given that currently there are so many millions of people who have such need for basic things like nutrition, clean water, housing, access to basic education, access to basic healthcare, if you're a consequentialist, can you ever justify spending your money on the dress, the holiday, the car? The answer is clearly no. Whichever way you allocate the numbers here for the pleasure and the relief from suffering caused by all these different options, there is no way your pleasure from a new car can ever outvalue the pleasure that somebody gets from not dying because of malaria. So your money should go to providing the malaria drugs that are needed. Therefore, you don't get the dress, you don't get the car, you don't get the holiday. That makes consequentialism a very demanding theory. It means that as long as you fulfill your very basic needs for food, shelter, even if we put basic education there, everything else, given the state of the world and the needs of billions of people, should go to somebody else, because we are all equal, and one unit of pleasure or one unit of suffering that refers to me counts exactly the same as that of everybody else. That makes the theory much too demanding and psychologically implausible. One modern response to this kind of problem is the 10% movement, and this is the idea that you should give 10% of your income to charities. That tries to say, well, you know, if 90% of your income should be given to charities, this is what you ought to do, at least do the 10%. That'll be kind of good enough. Makes consequentialism less demanding. Okay, let's try another objection. Now, we've come across this objection before. Try to think back to when we talked about hedonism and the idea that we should do whatever gives pleasure to you. This is the kind of objection that's always associated with theories that rely on this idea of promoting pleasure. And it is this. Do you remember? If you could be plugged into a machine that would give you the pleasure of all the experiences of a great life without the actual experiences, would you want to be plugged into that machine? You would have the pleasure of being a friend without actually having had any friends. You would have the pleasure of being a mother without actually ever having had children. But you would know no different. You would be completely deceived and you would get all this pleasure. This is Nozick, is the name of the philosopher, Nozick's experience machine, which is the idea behind the film The Matrix, of course. Most people would say that they would not want to be plugged into that kind of machine. They would really want to climb Mount Everest. They would really want to be parents and have the experience of doing these things, not simply the pleasure that comes from doing these things. Okay, third objection. Other things matter other than pleasure, and we saw this from the experience machine. The doing of things matters, but other values matter as well, not just the pleasure and the consequences of one's actions. Imagine a situation where you've been abducted by an evil villain and he's taken you away from all sources of help. Nobody's coming to help you. And he takes you to this village where he has enslaved all the villagers, and he says, you have a choice. I'm going to give you a gun. You can use it to kill one of the villagers, or I will kill all of the villagers. It is your choice. Now, if you're a consequentialist, what would you say? I want you to go away for a few minutes and answer the following questions. What would a consequentialist do in this sort of situation? What would a consequentialist guide you to do? What is the right thing to do here? Do you agree with a consequentialist? And if not, why not? Again, try to discuss this example with other people around you. See if you can find some family members or some friends who'd be willing to chat to you about this. Okay, you need to pause the video here and come back in a few minutes. Now, some of you may have come back really quickly because you have a quick and perfect answer to this dilemma. You would say, yeah, I'll shoot the one guy, take the gun of the villain, shoot the villain and be done with it. This answer comes up in every single seminar where I've ever taught these ideas. And I can see why you're saying this. You're trying to get away from my example, but I want you to stay in my example so that you see the point of it. Imagine it is impossible for you to do that. I don't know. The gun is a futuristic gun and it's calibrated to never kill the evil villain. You have no way out of this choice. This is the choice you must make. What are you going to do? What does the consequentialist say? It says, bring about the best consequences. What are the best consequences? One person dies or 10 people die? There is no question about it. In terms of the consequences, it is much better that one person dies rather than 10 people die. But surely there is a difference here because of agency, because it is you who are going to kill the one person as opposed to the evil villain killing the 10 people. When he kills the 10 people, the responsibility is on him. When you kill the one because he forced you in that position, there is still some responsibility because the death of the one is an expression of your agency. This doesn't necessarily mean that it is wrong to kill the one rather than choose to let him kill the 10, but that the consequentialist approach doesn't resolve the moral issue. Simply saying it is better for one to die than for 10 to die doesn't resolve the moral blame you will feel for being the person who killed someone else. Matters are more complicated. We can construct other examples to bring out this point even more strongly. Imagine there's been a serial killer who's been terrorizing your small town. He has killed a large number of people. You never know when he's going to strike again. And the police have been extremely unsuccessful in finding him. They are not able, they don't have any clues at all, there is no progress. Your entire small town is terrorized. Businesses are closed, parents are keeping their children away from school. People are completely freaked out at night when they're alone in their own homes. The whole fabric of society is almost dissolving because people are starting to buy guns and are trying to protect themselves in their own homes from this serial killer whom nobody can catch. Imagine also that you know that the serial killer is gone, but you can't prove that. So people will continue to be very afraid, and you're going to continue to have all these bad consequences. Psychological suffering, economic suffering, the possibility of vigilantes taking justice into their own hands. All these bad consequences are going to continue, but you can't prove that the serial killer has left. What you can do is find an innocent person, let's say a homeless person, who has no family, doesn't contribute anything to society. See, I'm making here the value of this person in terms of the consequences of what they bring to this world quite low. And you can frame this homeless person for all these serial killings, at which point your small town has a capital punishment, he will be found guilty and he will be put to death. And everybody will feel a lot better afterwards. So on the one hand, you're killing a homeless person, but they don't have a job, so they don't contribute in social utility in that way. They're fairly miserable themselves, let's say, because they have psychological problems, therefore not much is lost by them not continuing their lives. They don't have any friends and family who are going to miss them, and on the other hand, you have all this good utility because you will reassure your citizens, shops will open again, the vigilantes will sell their guns, everything will settle down to normal. Purely looking at the consequences, it looks like framing the innocent person is the right thing to do. But most people would not like this solution. If you're one of these people who feels unease at this solution, try to articulate why that is. Why is it not okay to take one innocent person and frame them for something they didn't do if it's going to produce the best consequences? Why isn't this a correct way of producing the best consequences? Well, most people would say because there are considerations of justice here, that doing this is unfair. But remember, the consequentialist doesn't care about considerations of justice that are not tethered to the consequences. That's why we made the whole thing secret. Nobody knows who the serial killer is, nobody knows that he's left the town, nobody will find out that you're framing an innocent person. That way, we've uncoupled justice from its consequences. Yet most people would say that there is still something wrong about the situation, where you frame an innocent person even though this is the choice that brings about the best consequences for the greatest number of people. Justice seems to matter intrinsically, in itself, not just because of the consequences it brings about. And here there's a vast number of really exciting examples that people throw at the consequentialist. Another one is this: imagine that you're perfectly healthy and you happen to be an organ match donor for another 50 people, which is the astounding number of people that could possibly benefit from anyone who donates their body to organ donation. But you're perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with you and you're not going to die. But if we killed you, then we would be saving 50 people. We would be saving lives with hearts and lungs and kidneys. We would be improving people's lives with corneas and skin transplants. The possibilities here are for generating utility are enormous. And because they're 50 and you're just one, however great your life may be and however much utility you might produce through your life, they're probably going to win out because it's a numbers game. And yet, we would not want to say that it is the moral thing to do to drag healthy people off the streets and kill them in the process of harvesting their organs in order to save 50 others. Okay, hang in there, because I have, how many more? I think 2 more objections for consequentialism. Now let's see, which one have we done? We've done that one, we've done too demanding. Oh, we have the last one. Okay, you're in luck. This is the very last one. One of the advantages of consequentialism is also claimed by some people to be its problem. You know how I said to you that it's a very egalitarian theory, that everybody counts for the same? So 1 unit of my pleasure is the same as 1 unit of somebody else's pleasure. I can't choose something purely because it's better for me. It has to have better consequences overall for everyone, and everybody counts. Well, some people can say that this is not the right kind of impartiality. That in some cases, who people are and what their relationship to us might be is morally important. So there are 2 babies drowning. There are always babies drowning in these philosophical examples. And I only have time to save one. And let's say the utilities are equally balanced. But one of these babies is my baby. Most people would say that it is perfectly morally permissible to choose my baby rather than the baby I do not know and save my baby. That some partial considerations are part of morality. Not that we tolerate them, but that we morally ought to do them. That we ought to treat our friends differently from the way we treat other people. That this is not just the way it is, but the way that it should be. Okay. Virtue ethicists will have something to say about that. So we'll come back to that after deontology. We'll do deontology next. Okay, well done. If you got to the end of this video, you did really well. This was really tough stuff and it went on for a long time. So that's consequentialism, a theory that says that the right thing to do is whatever brings about the best consequences. It has certain objections. In actual philosophical debate, of course, there are many replies to these objections and many ways in which consequentialist theories have become much more sophisticated in light of these objections. But for us, we're going to stop there and look at deontology next time. Since you've been so good, at this point in my lectures, I would normally offer you some chocolates to make sure you come back again. This is not an option really. If you have some chocolates, eat some on me. I'll offer you a dog instead, since you've been with me through all these videos. There's Oski. Hello, Oski. Show yourself. There's a good boy. There's a good boy. Good stuff. See you next time for deontology. Bye.